Folks, we're going to try to get started. I am really excited about this session, and the inspiration for this session really comes from one of the panelists and from our own work and the realization that everybody says in the world of funders that they want nonprofits to have more of an evidence base for their work, do more measurement. And then raises the interesting question, what are funders doing to support nonprofits in doing that work? And we have just got a terrific group of folks to talk about this. So moderating will be Nadya Shmavonian, former president CEO of Public-Private Ventures and a board member at CEP. And our panelists are Dan Cardinali, who is awesome, president of communities in school, did a webinar with us and was just fabulous. And we said, you have to come to our conference and talk to folks about your experience. Morino, whose work really is the inspiration for this session. His book, Leap of Reason, Managing to Outcomes in an Era of Scarcity, is a book that all funders should read. And finally, Denise Zeman, president and CEO of St. Luke's Foundation. And Denise is really a funder who is working hard on this question. So I'm really pleased to have this panel here and to turn it over to Nadya. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil. We're excited to move into this. We're going to take this in a little bit different pattern than others. Everyone's going to have a moment to speak, and I'm just going to introduce the proposition we're here to discuss. I think we can all agree there's a stronger need today than ever to know that nonprofits are maximizing their performance and delivering strong outcomes. Both foundations and nonprofits can at least state that this is a shared value. I hope you all had a chance to look at the recent panel report done by CEP called Room for Improvement, which examines the assumption that, quote, the extent to which foundations make a difference in society depends on the effectiveness of the nonprofits they fund. It's a logical proposition, and the majority of foundation CEOs believe nonprofits should be held to higher standards of evidence to demonstrate the effectiveness of their work. However, CEP's survey of nonprofit leaders in this report suggests that they want a lot more help from foundations in assessing and improving their performance. The majority of nonprofit leaders in the survey, 71%, reports receiving no foundation support, either financial or non-monetary, for their organization's assessment efforts. They report little conversation with funders about what performance targets they should set, which data to collect, how to interpret the data, how to develop the skills of staff to collect and interpret data, and the results of performance assessments. They report wanting greater engagement and dialogue with their officers in this regard. And not surprisingly, particularly for those of you who've worked in the nonprofit community, these leaders commented on the significant burden that the disparate reporting requirements, definitions, and metrics from different foundations place on their organizations. The majority of nonprofit leaders believe that their foundation funders care primarily about how nonprofit performance information can be helpful to the funders, as opposed to how it can also be useful to the nonprofits they're funding. And more precisely, in this survey, 53% of leaders agree with the statement, quote, our foundation funders are primarily interested in information about my organization's performance that will be useful to them, rather than information that provides utility to me and my organization. And then just to put a final bow on this muddiness from the just released Foundation Transparency Report, quote, only 29% of nonprofit leaders report having a clear understanding of how foundations use the information from their organizations that they're required to provide. So there's not a sense that there's an investment in these nonprofits, in their ability to assess and improve their performance, nor is there clarity about even how the foundations are using the information that they receive. I think we have a wonderful panel here to help us respond to and unpack these findings, and also to speculate on what's causing this disconnect between the stated interest in improving nonprofit performance, but the lack of perception from the nonprofit side that this is occurring. Mario's done more than anyone to ground us in the gritty realities and possibilities of managing to outcomes in his book, Leap of Reason. And I do trust that he'll break out of his otherwise shy demeanor and share an opinion or two on how to encourage and develop high-performing nonprofits. Denise brings the perspective and discipline of healthcare's very long-term emphasis on using data to improve performance to her work with St. Luke's Foundation of Cleveland, and we'll look forward to hearing from her. And Dan, as the CEO of a remarkably high-performing nonprofit, Communities in Schools, can shed light for us, I think, on whether these findings ring true and what he thinks foundations can do to either meet this expressed need or at a minimum to reward nonprofits, not punish them, as Majora suggested last night, that find their way to high performance on their own. So I'm going to start with, by asking Mario to share some thoughts. I think one of the things you missed yesterday, Mario, was Peter Sim's talk early afternoon. He introduced the high concept from Pixar of how you move ideas from suck to non-suck. And I'm hoping you'll talk with us about how nonprofits and their foundation partners can help move from their performance from suck to non-sucks.
I'll do my best. Thank you, Nadya. I have to admit, though, I was hoping after your long stint in Bellagio, Italy, that you're going to come back with a little bit of an Italian lilt to your voice, your moderation voice. But and we have a very strong Italian representation, I might add, too. So, but Nadya, you're a great moderator, a good friend, and thank you for doing this today. So, hopefully, I can make that transition you pointed out. So. When we came out with Leap of Reason, it's actually 2 years ago last Sunday. It was May 19th, 2011. Shortly after, and Lowell remembers this, shortly after the book went out, we were getting a lot of good comments, but a friend of mine just shot me a quick email, and he's a good friend, and he's fairly blunt. He says, hey, he's read the book, it was good. Actually, it was a little okay, but your timing was great. And he was really right. I think it's a good book, but the timing was really relevant. We didn't pick it. It was serendipitous. It's better to be lucky than smart. But the reality was that this is an era of great scarcity and huge change that's going on in the field today. And therefore, delivering a message, we hope, in a respectful way of tough love was well timed. And I think from the reaction we're getting, it appears that we hit some kind of pulse or tempo in the sector that has been very surprising to us. And I'll try and relate that to you as we go on. I think the era is forcing leaders from all sectors, and I'll be glad to talk about this more later, but it's especially those in nonprofits and those their stakeholders, to look in the mirror, because the times ahead are tough, and I don't sugarcoat this. I think that leaders like yourself are beginning to grasp the severity of what lies ahead, and I do say that with that kind of caution, because we're in store for a period of great ambiguity, enormous uncertainty, and turbulent disruption. And I'll walk you through the rationale for that. And all you got to do, by the way, is pick up a newspaper, and I'll get to that. And the way you get through this is, again, it's exemplary performance, it's resiliency to adapt and respond, and to even reinvent yourself to make it through the chaos that we'll see, and also to seize the opportunity that's there. But to put a little emphasis on the reality of this disruption, we took some headlines, and I'm going to just read them off. And I just want you to just hear the headline, that's all. So, and I'll give you the date and the line. May 12th, it comes from a station here in Detroit. Emerging manager says Detroit's finances are crumbling. CNN, day later. City of Detroit is financially insolvent. It's not just Detroit. USA Today, May 16th. Here are the 10 next cities in California that'll go bankrupt. Education, May 10th, Fox News. Possible $800 million hit in Michigan. School budget has education supporters very concerned. May 12th, New York Times, student debt and the crushing of the American dream. Jump ahead, the healthcare. It comes from Medscape article, Medicare cuts will affect 80% of all oncology practices. Just think about that comment. You know how many members of your family have been in that situation. And then where have all the jobs gone? That was the title in the New York Times, May 4th. Well, I asked we had an investment meeting in our team 2 weeks ago, and I asked the investment managers we work with, I said, give me some data on the real unemployment rates in the country. Not what we usually read in the headlines. And we got this from, it's a BLS report. I'm going to read this to you. The share of the working age population in the labor force, known as the labor force participation rate, fell to 63.3%. That means there's 36.7% not working. 36.7% not working. It's the lowest it's been since 1979. Guess who bears the brunt of so much of that unemployment? It's the nonprofit services that have to meet that increasing demand. I didn't mention climate change. Pick up CNN, just check Oklahoma. The violence, the culture of violence that's emerging in our nation. I didn't mention the aging of our nation in terms of demographics. Nor did I mention the dysfunctional political system we're victims to today. If you don't think there's disruption ahead, you are not reading anything or hearing anything. It's significant, and we have to react in really innovative ways to deal with it. Now, people like Dan, courageous leader in the nonprofit sector, he gets it, and I've known him. I respect so much the work he's done. And what he does, he puts a mirror to his face in his organization. He looks for the relevance. He looks for the value. He continually strives in his team to improve that organization. That's an exemplar in our field. And he knows that the success of getting through this is going to be a function of improving quality, better outcomes, figuring out how to do that at a lower cost, while you're going to have to do that while the demand for what you do increases. When you put higher quality, lower cost, increased demand together, you cannot approach it incrementally. You're dealing with quantum change to an organization over time. And in terms of a courageous foundation leader, I have the pleasure of knowing Denise. She gets it. And she's literally reinvented a foundation, St. Luke's Foundation, based in Cleveland, Ohio. And it's no longer a foundation that does everything for all players. And it goes to basically getting, finding strong grantees, to support those grantees to be better, to build their capacity, to focus more on regional outcomes. And the problem is that, as Nadya points out, by CEP's research, both Dan and Denise are outliers in this sector. And what we need to do is make them the norm in this sector over the next 10 years. This panel is focused on the funder side, what we can do as funders. And I'd like to start it off provocatively with a quote from David Hunter. And for those of you who know David, he does not mince words. And this comes from his book, Working Hard and Working Well. And I quote, "An admonishment to those funders who demand performance in which they don't invest, results for which they don't pay, and accountability from which they exempt themselves." Generally speaking, I think it's a fair criticism. There are many things that funders can do to affect this challenge and this criticism, and I'll just offer a few suggestions. I'll touch on two. First and foremost, I think we need a fundamental mind shift in funders, I mean foundations, private donors, public agency funding bases, that realizes that to get the great impact we all seek and to affect the individuals we serve in a positive way, that we must invest to build good to great leadership and management capacities in these organizations, to help them become high-performing for one reason, to fulfill mission. And they need that muscle and rigor in a management sense to survive and reinvent themselves in the turbulence ahead. My problem with this is the discussions that often go on, and you know what I'm talking about. There's always the next thing, the next model, the next election. There's no silver bullet. There's no magic elixir. There's no shortcut to this. And we're all looking for those things. It doesn't exist, folks. This is about fundamental execution. It's about ensuring good leadership, developing good leadership. It's about management rigor in an organization, developing management practices in a constructive way consistent with nonprofit culture. It's about ensuring high-performing staff that function in a world of continuous improvement and high performance, and do it willingly and knowingly for their self-improvement and for the better service of those they serve. That's all cultural. And that's what we have to support. And it's about organizations. It's about building organizations, that infrastructure that once you do, it gives year in and year out over time. This means, in a large sense, at least part of what you do, or we all do, is large multi-year grants that provide operating funds, get this concept of overhead and allocation rates off the table. We just kid ourselves with it. It's like a joke. In the private world, we call that good management. In this sector, we call it overhead, and we punish people. Provide sustaining capital, provide growth capital to organizations so they can get the kind of results that we want them to get. And don't kid ourselves with $10,000 and $15,000 capacity building grants. You can't open an envelope for a strategic plan, for Christ's sake. And what I mean by that is you want to give strategic assistance with that money and not just restrictive mandates. You want to create a just environment where that information is used constructively by the foundation and the nonprofit to improve themselves and improve their work together, and not in a punitive or recriminating manner. And it's a culture of continuous improvement again. And we need to also augment our staffs and realize we need to augment our skill sets, and that means in program officers who have operating experience in organizations today, who know how to identify leadership traits, who know how to build leadership and management skill sets, and know what it takes to build great organizations. That's operating knowledge. And that helps then in the selection and support of who you fund. In a conversation we had at a Harvard meeting, Matt Bannock was there from the Meteor Foundation, and he said they have 4 full-time recruiters in the foundation, 4 full-time recruiters that do nothing but help their grantees find the kind of talent they need. You know, I could go on and on, but you know, by this time my blood pressure starts rising. I start talking too fast, so I'm done for now. Go ahead.
We don't want that. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mari. Denise, can you share your perspective from the funder side?
Of course. So, good morning, everybody. This year, the St. Luke's Foundation in Cleveland will be celebrating our $100 millionth granted over the last 15 years. And so, in anticipation of our 15th anniversary, we decided to really do some introspection and take a look at, you know, kind of what we had done and what we had done well and what we had learned from the 15 years of grant making. We had learned over 2 very tricky economic cycles that the traditional spending policy by which we determined how much we would have to distribute each year gave us more to give when the economy was better and less to give when the community needed us the most. And so we started our journey looking at our spending policy, and we looked at what our colleagues were doing around the country. And we decided on a new approach, a different approach for us, through which we would establish a floor that we thought was reasonable, enough money to make the kind of change that we wanted to make, but that would give our community and those who were really, you know, doing the heavy lifting to advance our mission, the resources that they needed when they needed it most, and a more predictable level of giving. We had also learned that our sort of fruit salad of grants, we had this broad definition of health, and you know, when you look at health, you could pretty much consider everything bad that happens as impacting health in a negative way. But for our first 15 years, we had this sort of fruit salad of grants, and we decided that by doing that approach really wasn't yielding the impact that we hoped to have. We were also asking ourselves some very probing questions, okay? Things like, where had we gained traction? What can we support that really measurably moves the needle? And more basic, we asked our grantees how we could support them and what could we do to improve our processes to help them? And at the end of the day, we asked, how could we figure out how to give more and make greater impact while trying to remain viable over the long haul? And through this process, we learned many, many, many valuable lessons. I mean, when you talk to the people that you're trying to support, you learn a ton. But the biggest learning was that we learned the value of learning itself. You know, we knew what we knew. We were beginning to know what we didn't know. But we made a renewed commitment to really become a learning organization. And then we had to ask ourselves, okay, so what did we want to learn? You know, why did we want to learn it? And the biggest question, I think, for me was, were we willing to take what we learned with humility and respect for those from whom we were learning and with whom we were learning, and turn that into action? At the same time, and Mario mentioned the timing of his book, it was perfect for us because we got this book in the mail, free book. Hey, you know, this is cool. How often do you get a free book from a person that we really respected? We had known Mario because we're in Cleveland, and so we got this book and we read it. The staff read it, the board read it, and we really embraced the concept in the book of rethinking, redesigning, and reinventing. And that's exactly what we did. We also worked with the TCC group to learn more about learning itself and how we could be or become an organization that learned every day. So we changed the spending policy to one that gives a higher, more consistent level of support based on a floor. And this year that represents about a 7% payout, significantly higher than our 5%. We also narrowed our scope of grant making significantly. You know, we really embraced the idea that we wanted to go deeper with a smaller number of grantees. And we narrowed our focus to 3. Being a health conversion foundation, first and foremost, we're interested in health. But within health, we narrowed our definition much, much further. We also have a very uber local focus on the neighborhoods that were historically served by our hospital. And so strong communities in urban Cleveland are a focus for us. And we work very closely in the neighborhood. And in fact, later this year, we're going to be moving back to the neighborhood to use our money on a project that we consider key and critical to the neighborhood. And then a newer area for us, because we know that all the stuff that we do exists within the context of a family. We established a portfolio that looks at resilient families, focusing on the voice of the family and those things that make urban families so strong and resilient. We also engaged the community in our decision making. Each of our program areas now has an expert program, senior program officer with experience in the field, and a program strategy committee that's populated not only by our board members, but also people who are working in the field every day and showing great results. They're at our decision-making table. And through a lot of dialogue, focus groups, one-on-one surveys with our grantees, we identified a set of capacity building areas that we would fund over and above general operating or program support. And these include areas such as leadership development, collaboration, communications, policy and advocacy, and outcomes and learning. We want to be able to help the organizations that we support become really strong in these areas. We also took a serious look at our grant-making process, and we streamlined it significantly and changed to a much more user-friendly grant-making software. So you may ask, are we finished? My response to that would be that I think we've just begun. I think we are on the right track, but I think we also know that we have lots and lots and lots to learn. And so we'll test ourselves. In fact, just this week, we launched our grantee and applicant surveys, and we'll see whether we were smart in just turning everything upside down and then asking people how they liked it.
Thank you, Denise.
Great.
Dan, can you give us a perspective from the ground in terms of what
try.
kind of help you've gotten, what's been most valuable, what you would advise and
Sure.
need from foundations?
So I want to start a little bit with a story and actually frame this around a story because I think it's much more descriptive of how this works, at least in my experience. To start with, our organization is about one very simple thing, which is we believe that if a caring adult who is both passionate and skilled at being in the lives of at-risk children can be systematically introduced into the public education system, transformation is possible that is otherwise not available to that student. It's a very simple insight, right? And thank God the social science research and the neuroscience has caught up. That once you can actually bring a kid's stress level down, she or he is available to all sorts of things. So that's kind of what we've been trying to do for a very long time. We had a crisis in the early 90s. We're about a 37-year-old federated nonprofit when we were getting a fair amount of money from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, OJJDP. And they said, we've hired Urban Institute and we're going to do an evaluation of you. And that was all we knew. And then about a year and a half, 2 years later, we were handed a report and said, you know what? Learn from this. Not helpful. And then 2, they said, and by the way, the kind of top line conclusion is, if you've seen one Communities in Schools, you've seen one Communities in Schools. At that point, we were a federated network of probably maybe 38 or 40 local affiliates. So that is the decision point. And who owns the leadership there? It really isn't the funding community. It is us. And we made a decision at that point to bring in our best leadership based on the best data that we had. And in the mid-90s, we developed something called the Quality and Standard System. It was our first attempt at performance metrics. And it wasn't somebody else telling us what was important, and it wasn't using the best social science research. It was actually using practitioners who every day were out there watching what was effective practice. And they, early on, bucketed them into 2 fundamental categories. How do you run a sustainable nonprofit organization? One set of standards. And then the second set of standards is how do you run really good school-based operations? And we went through a process in the 90s of trying to figure this out and implement it. And it was, in fact, philanthropy that enabled us to do that. The Knight Foundation in the mid-90s said, this seems like this is innovative, and it looks like it's potentially important. And they gave us a set of resources over actually about 8 years to refine the process and to roll it out. It was hard to attract other funders, but it was enough for us to build internally the awareness and our own observation that actually this stuff matters. And then and that was our kind of like, oh my God, is that mold on the bread actually something that's important? And we began to see, actually, we think it is. So in the early part of 2000s, it was again the Knight Foundation that said, you guys seem to be onto something. Here's a grant to come up with an appropriate evaluation design. Hire the best firm that works for you, who has the highest credibility, and collectively come up with a design that will work for you. That was one of the most important decisions, because what it enabled us to do is to own the evaluation without controlling it, and to build into it an implementation study so that we understood when we were getting results, what we were doing. And then, as philanthropy works, Knight said, we're going to hand this off to somebody else. It wasn't clear who at the time, and so we began this process. We actually developed a modular design so that the study could be invested in pieces, because our experience is no one's going to pay $5 million to do a 5-year longitudinal evaluation. Who in their right mind would do that? And sure enough, by dint of relationships, and actually Ed Skloot, who I saw earlier, we were talking, was in the meeting when I pitched this to a whole group of funders. And Atlantic Philanthropies stepped in and said, we're kind of interested in this. And so they invested, at first, $2.5 million. And then I got that phone call. And I had my entire team on the call because they said, we've just been reviewing your financials. We were in a lot of financial distress. And we want to talk to you about this investment. They're like, all right, I'm going to have to go drinking tonight. This is not going to be a good call. I've had lots of these. And the program officer at the time said, we've looked at your financials. We're extremely interested in your design, and then kind of long pause. And as a result, we're going to actually give you an additional $1 million of general operating so that you can focus in on doing the work. There was this long pause because we had never had that response. And the program officer said to us, are you still there? And yes, we're just trying to figure out, we don't know how to respond, actually, because that isn't usually how it works. And then a year later, after they saw how we were implementing actually partnering with ICF International, they said, terrific, we're going to give you the rest of the study because we want you to just continue to move this thing forward. So that was from 2005 to 10. In the middle of that study, because of the design that Knight helped us to develop, we could extrapolate out where we could see results. And again, no one told us to do this. We said we're going to then take that knowledge, take our quality and standards from the 90s, and do the 2.0 version, which we now call the total quality system. So we have a problem. The evaluation came back in 2010 and said, you guys actually are really good. You lower dropout rates and improve graduation rates, and nobody at your scale can do that. However, about half your network is delivering solid results, and the other half, the other 100 affiliates, aren't. There's episodic results, and they're not systemic. So we have to figure out how to drive quality. And this is the moment, right? Great. We kind of know what effective practice is. We're in an arc of evaluation, and what do you do with that? And whose responsibility is that? So thank God for a long-term relationship with the Bridgespan Group, who really partnered with us, and we went out and we developed our own growth capital strategy and began to pitch it. That was in the middle of 07, 08, so you launch a $50 million growth capital campaign and the economy begins to go south. So a set of foundations, particularly long-term funders, the Robertson Foundation, despite the economy, invested a $10 million fungible amount of money for us to drive our TQS out into our network. So the economy begins to turn around. We actually fail. We fail in the first year of rolling TQS out because we mismanaged the change. It seemed to me, and I'm a community organizer, but you kind of forget after a while, that in fact, if you showed someone a graph that if you did this, you'd drive results for kids, and if you did that, you wouldn't, that was self-evident that you would change behavior. And people don't operate that way. So we went into a found pilot strategy. We created centers of strength where high performers could then show not only that the results made a difference, but they could raise more money and serve more kids. And that incentivized our network to begin to move forward. And then came this wonderful phase around growth capital. Ed McConnell Clark, the Wallace Foundation, now Schusterman, have said, we see something really fundamental going on here. And we want to help you aggregate capital, give you as much fungibility as possible to drive results. And oh, by the way, we want to partner with you, not because we have the answers, but we think collectively with you, we can figure out how to get over the obstacles that you find. So it's been this kind of wonderful ride, crazy. But the three things I want to point out as kind of key learnings. The first is power. Foundations do have a lot of power. You have a lot of money, but you don't have all the power. It requires you to find partners, and those partners to own their own power. And we know that when you share power, it multiplies. So at the heart of that then is what we've learned with at-risk kids. It's really all about relationships. To the extent that we can sit down, build a trusting relationship, and know that both of us can learn together, share together, and fight obstacles together, then we're all better off. And that is a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do with at-risk kids, and it's very hard to do in the philanthropic community. For reasons you all know, people are pitching you all the time, right? You got little bullseyes, and you're like, oh, not another one. And we're all like, oh, who's your list? You say, okay, I got him, go, right? So we know that this is a problem, and it takes time. It just does. Number two, I think, is this notion that there is Mario mentioned, I think very rightly, the importance of leadership. What often goes unnoticed or under-resourced are boards. My board hires me. You all don't hire me. You may be my funders. I'm ultimately accountable to them. If they don't get the accountability and line up with what we're trying to get accomplished, there is an enormous disconnect. That means I'm now managing lots of stakeholders, and I'm going to begin to separate you instead of put you together. I'm going to begin to pitch what I think you need to hear rather than to try and create a learning and a movement forward. So in our own work with our 200 affiliates, to the extent that we have actually engaged the boards and partnered the boards and the executive directors, you can see a categorical shift moving in the right direction. The final thing is Atlantic Philanthropies demonstrated early on, as did Robertson, when we were in our absolute worst kind of financial organizational state, that general operating raised the bar on trust. We did not have any track record that indicated that we would steward general operating dollars well. It was a brutal fact. And yet, they intervened and said, we're going to give this to you. And in the case of Robertson, they said, and we have one requirement. You cannot grow. What? Like, we've scaled hugely in the 90s. That's why people give us money. Nope. We actually want you to use this money to stabilize your operations. And they did not give us a lot of other requirements. So the expectation that you have for at-risk kids, of high expectations, they will rise to the occasion. So is our sector. Trust us, create high expectations, hold us accountable to driving our own quality impact. Super important. So last thing I just want to say, I think I've gone over time. So internally, I love to share this with foundations because I rarely get to do this. We have our own little kind of way of assessing you all, right? So just fun things to do. So there's a group of you that we call the capacity builders. We think of you as like ambulance chasers. You want to know when the problem is, and you have some mechanism internally that says, if we intervene with communities and schools and getting them their data management system, it's going to be transformative. So we package it like this is our limiting factor, right? It's incumbent on us to be able to make sure it is a strategic investment, but we pitch it in a way that creates some feeling of like intervening and responding. Very effective. The second one are the knowledge builders. There are a group of you that are all about very much fundamentally contributing to the larger knowledge base. It's been very important. I use a lot of you as kind of checking ideas out and going to who's the smartest on these issues. So we pitch you about how we're contributing to knowledge. We're building the field of integrated student service provision. We're trying nonlinear scale. It goes on, right? And it's a very effective way. So there's a kind of cohort, a way that you all operate in this way. The third way are what we call the kind of impact investors and the scale folks. It's this atom everyone's trying to crack. We sit in a particular sweet spot by dint of our size and our resources. But there's a particular way to package that. And it actually requires a particular engagement with our board because it tends to be a big board engagement. So we know that, and we have to kind of onboard those pieces. So we have this shorthand internally as we kind of categorize you. So what kind of a pitch are we going to? So it goes both ways, and I just wanted to share that with you. The final thing is one of my favorite social critics, Carly Simon, has two songs that I really like. One is It's Coming Around Again. You know, in that song she just talks about, you know, it's just kind of really the daily life of plugging away. It's really not sexy trying to get this work done anymore. It's about the hard block and tackle. You know, you burn the toast, you get it again, you give it to the kids, you get them on school, you pick them up, you get them to school again. It's a lot of that right now for us, of growing our impact. Not super sexy, but it is critical. And showing up and doing it well every day is hard. The second one is The Stuff That Dreams Are Made Of. Remember that song? Mm-hmm. She has this great kind of juxtaposition of saying, you know, got this friend who's got a new boyfriend and they're in Malibu and they've got all these fun toys, and I really think that's cool and I kind of want that. But then I'm looking at my gig and I'm saying, you know, I actually have what I really imagined. I'm growing a family, I'm making a difference in kids' lives, and I'm launching these kids in a direction that is going to be what actually life should be about. And so this notion of our work being easily distracted by the toys in Malibu, as opposed to the really growing it and making it work. And the ongoing, yep, I got that wrong, got in a fight with my kid, or, you know, my husband and I are really at odds, and I got to figure this out because we're committed to getting to the next level. So I think that's a lot of the work. So I often listen to Carly Simon when I'm in those moods of just getting a no from a funder. Thank you.
Thank you. So as I listen to all three of you, there is the Carly Simon leitmotif, which is it's not sexy, it's hard tackle, it's hard work, it's, you know, you have to stay with it. And I think your story, Dan, is very compelling in terms of the tenacity of initially Knight and then others to stay with over the long haul. And I guess I'd like to ask any of you to comment on what are the obstacles? Why do we not see more of those long-term partnerships and investments? What are some of the factors that are interrupting that? Because I don't think there's any substitute. I mean, if I look at fields that have been built, it is often with the singular focus of a funder who's just determined and is going to stay with it and take the time to do the early implementation studies and really learn and let you knock your head and build from that. but why don't we see more of that?
Well, I'll start. I think that we as funders can be fickle. You know, to use your analogy, you know, we like to look at the toys in Malibu and we hear about things that are going on, but I think you're absolutely right. Just in our short experience of, you know, 15 years, those grants we've made over a long period of time, those initiatives that we have supported for years are pretty much, with a few exceptions, the ones that have shown continuous growth, the ones, you know, that we've been able to establish the trusting relationships in. But I think that, you know, funders are sometimes afraid of, you know, kind of creating a dependency, or, you know, you hear all these things. You know, you don't stop loving your kids and supporting your kids, even though they're in their 30s, I know that for a fact, because you want them to succeed, you know, and so you don't stop. And I think, you know, applying lessons from life to philanthropy is not a bad thing.
It's a great comment. And actually, for those of you who haven't read it, Phil has a wonderful blog on the CEP website on dependency. And I think that concept of bringing those life skills and, you know, not making, it's not a bad word.
Right.
Mari, you were going to comment?
Yeah, I mean, Dan hit it, and it's not sexy. What we're talking about is that's the problem. Building a great organization, there's nothing new about it, first of all. There's nothing mysterious about it. And it's not sexy, so it doesn't grab people's attention. I mean, I'll be that blunt about it. And it's hard work, and oftentimes the skills in the foundation, which are really good skills, don't align to the skills that it takes to help people build great organizations. I mean, those are two really, I would say, two facts of the situation today. And in reality, I'll quote Jim Collins on this. Jim came out with a book, is Choose to Be Great. And we got someone wrote us on that, and they wrote, said, you know, the problem going on today in education, as an example, said, you know, all this effort going on in education reform, but the reality is the real solution might be Jim Collins' take, which is if you want great education, then instill a case where you're going to have a rigorous management process and a culture that deals with continuous improvement, and know that it takes a lot of time to build this kind of greatness in organizations, and fund it, and support it, and nurture it over time. And I do think that's how one builds great organizations today. And great organizations have disproportional impact. And if you want to have that impact through your money, then putting that money into that kind of long-term growth of organizations for that sustainability, that meaningful impact, I think that's the game.
Mm-hmm.
Just two comments, I don't know how much more I can add. One is something, it's a quagmire for me that I don't really have an answer for, but I can share it with you, and probably it's no new information. But so we've had this great 15-year run of management consulting impacting both nonprofits and foundations. So this notion that communities and schools has to fit into a funder's box of theory of change. And really it's about compliance with that, whatever the architecture of that is we haven't fully figured out that if we're going to be a contractor, then just do a fee-for-service, stay out of our business. We'll give you a price, and if we can then deliver, great. If not, you can find somebody else. But you don't get to play the philanthropic role of capacity building when you're really just filling somebody's theory of change. Yeah. I'm very strong on this, and we walk away from a fair amount of, I mean, we have the same conversation with lots of folks. Oh, you know, we've looked at you, you guys are great. Could you do X? No, actually we can't. And so it's a good conversation. We can move on quickly. I don't know how to resolve that, but it's certainly a diagnostic. The other, I think, hopeful thing is, I get asked a lot, is there a marketplace for results? So you've delivered great results, you have this third-party evaluation, you can do stuff that's hard to do at scale. I think the answer is yes, no. The yes part is it's fascinating who is picking up nationally our work and funding it. It is the corporate community. They need to align with an organization that can consistently do what they do, which is produce results for their investors, in their case, their board. So they're basically buying our results, and that is happening increasingly. That's very good news for us, because it gives us fairly fungible dollars to continue to do our work. The bad news is the real funding source, public dollars, that is not the case. It's nascent. It is still 90% relationships. I still have to figure out who is beholden to what set of stakeholders in order to get policy moving forward. That's true at the local, state, and federal level. And foundations, I think somewhere in between. It's amazing to me how incredibly important relationships are. Can I say one last thing? I apologize for going on. It's just about the point about program officers. Could I just encourage you all to invest as heavily as you can in their capacity? It is my experience that it is the exception, not the rule, that most program officers have an understanding of what it actually takes to operate, in our case, a federated network. And so I provide a lot of technical assistance in kind of bringing, and happy to do it. It's expensive for us to do it that way. So I'd love for that to be a focal point.
Yeah, no, I was going to push to hear more about that because I know in Mario's comments the notion of augmenting program officers. And when we had our conversation a couple months ago, the main, you weren't on that call, but the main focus was improving the staffing, the skills, and better aligning the capacity of the foundation to support what at least is espoused as a value, which is helping to raise more high-performing nonprofits. Any other thoughts? I don't know if you had any further thoughts on that in terms of what can be. I think that's a good admonishment or request, Dan. But
I think it's extremely important. One of the things that we have in place, we've put in place, everybody says they're a learning organization, but one of the things that we've done is we have established a budget for board and staff development, because we have to develop our staff, we have to develop our board, and I'm really happy I have a couple of board members here today. But that takes time, that takes money, it takes effort, and each member of my staff, including me, we all have a professional development plan. And so we are building that capacity internally. We hire great people, but we have to apply the same standards to ourselves internally that we do to the organizations that we support. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to continuously invest in the development of program staff.
That's right.
can I take us back to the first quote that I shared that is in the Room for Improvement study, which is stated as an assumption, which is the extent to which foundations make a difference in society depends on the effectiveness of the nonprofits they fund. But I want to push people to comment on whether that's still the compact. And I think about the last, 25 some plus years since I got involved in the field of philanthropy and the movement toward strategic philanthropy and so on. I wonder where the locus of emphasis really is and how many foundations still see that engine of change as the nonprofit versus some other, whether it's the foundation itself or what is a more complicated landscape now with other actors.
I'll just give you a view, and it may be a different view than this audience hears, I don't know. I do interface a lot to what you would call the new or the recent money of the last 20 years, and they don't look at it like that at all. I mean, I'll use one couple that I've interfaced with. They're in the Giving Pledge type category. And their view is they're trying to advance a social change. And they don't really care if they're working through a for-profit, a government initiative, or a nonprofit. That pathway to them is irrelevant. What's relevant to them is where the best capacity will be to get that end result. Not that that's an eloquent statement, but the way I framed it is not uncommon today with the relatively new money. And I mean, when I say that, of the last 20 years, the money that came out of the dot-com explosion, the financial services explosion, and really the money that's still being generated at the upper echelons of our society today. It's relatively new money, and it's very formative money, it's malleable money, but they look at this very differently.
Mm-hmm. But I think that many foundations still think of ourselves, and listen to the way we talk about ourselves. I have to catch myself sometimes. When I talk about the work that we support, sometimes I'll catch myself saying, we do this, we do this. We don't do the doing, you know? And yet, if we listen to ourselves, you know, it makes it sound like we're doing all this stuff. We're not doing all this stuff. You know, that's where the humility piece comes in. That's something that I think about a lot.
Can I just?
Yeah.
In our work with Venture Philanthropy Partners, which I don't run anymore, Carol Thompson-Cole runs, it's a continual tension we have because when we phrase what we do, everybody wants us to come up with our metrics, meaning, and we keep saying it's not about our metrics.
Yeah.
Our success is absolutely a function of the organizations that we invested in success. If they succeed, we succeed by default. It's that simple. And to say we have metrics is erroneous. Are the people that we've partnered with, that we've invested in, have they met their objectives? Have they succeeded? If they've succeeded, we've won.
Exactly.
But we're not doing the work. They're doing the work.
You know, I'm just struck by your question because I think there's two things. You know, and particularly Mario's point about kind of recent high net worth individuals who, at least in the education space, are playing a very powerful role. So my experience from the nonprofit side is we have to identify the zone of individual or institution, corporate or private foundation, that is interested in our product. And then everybody else gets blocked out. So that's, I think, and there's still a healthy group of folks that understand or are committed to or see as a vehicle their philanthropic investments through a citizen-based federated network that creates social change and serves kids at the same time. So that's a descriptive answer. The harder question for me is we just did a board retreat and we gave them a huge white paper and we asked them to consider our future and what the real goal of our organization was. So we work with 1.2 million of some of the nation's poorest kids. There are about 11 million poor kids in the K-12 space. And our board said, that's a pretty wide gap. It took us 37 years to get this big. How do we close that gap? And it's forcing a different kind of conversation and a question about our network. And so it's thrown up, I think, your question about the other thing is, can nonprofits, and we saw it yesterday in the slide with Professor Fry, right? Can we actually make a measurable difference against the large problems? So I think there's something about a churning in the sector that's happening. And on our end, we're asking, what's our responsibility in that larger conversation? It's a frightening conversation because it could mean shrinking or changing the way we do our work.
Thank you. And one last question, then we're going to open it to the audience, which maybe is associated with the churning. Listening to your story, Dan, and then certainly the values and the emphasis of the level of rigor that's needed to encourage high-performing organizations, can you all comment on the sort of state of the nonprofit sector and the degree to which there needs to be some greater consolidation? Because the kind of performance we're talking about and the kind of investments we're talking about, I think really the communities and schools example is a model of that, but it's over a long period of time and growth in that agency. And there are clearly a lot of other agencies that weren't selected. There can't be enough good funders to encourage that level of support. And the fact that it started, I think the other piece that I took from your story was, yes, there were fabulous funders who came in, but it started at the agency. You knew what you needed to measure, and you worked hard to figure that out. And I think that's in your book as well, Mario, is a really important piece. But is there room? Is there room for? Is it realistic to think that this is going to take hold with a wide swath of nonprofits, or is there going to be greater consolidation as we go forward?
Well, I think we can take, we can take some lessons from healthcare on that. My career prior to philanthropy was as a hospital administrator, and I was part of a group that merged 4 hospitals into one system, which then further merged into what then became the Cleveland Clinic Health System. These were organizations that were fierce competitors. We were close to each other. We shared medical staffs. We shared patient populations. We were always going after each other. And suddenly we were in a reimbursement environment that wouldn't support all of us. Right. And we got together in a loose affiliation, and that didn't work. And so we further consolidated to the point where we then ultimately consolidated into one board. And then we were able to take significant cost out of our organization, $10 million over like 2 years. But we also greatly improved our quality because we elevated the game and the standards were, and then when we became part of the Cleveland Clinic Health System, we further, elevated our game. I don't think that the lessons are necessarily, one for one, but there's a lot that can be learned from, the fact that you can improve quality by consolidation. You can lower cost. Doesn't always happen, but it's certainly possible. And there are models in other sectors, including healthcare, that really show how this can be done. In our community, we have a nonprofit sector that was built for a population of 1 million. In the last census in our city, we've dropped below 400,000. Do the math.
I just make a comment. I think two things. Consolidation will be imposed by the forces I tried to discuss early on. It's going to happen because the pie of money will shrink, and the pressure for demand for performance in communities is going to grow. And when you look at that, something's got to give, folks. Yeah. And you're seeing it in healthcare, as Denise pointed out. In full disclosure, I'm a director at the Cleveland Clinic, and I don't know the exact number, but we were given the number of hospitals that will close in the next 10 years. Do you know what ballpark? It was almost
It's like a third?
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, imagine the implications to communities about what we just said. And it's a large number, but we also just entered into a partnership. And I mean, I think the other thing I'm trying to get across, I don't think any organization today, unless you're really small, okay, if you don't have a discussion going on about consolidation and partnerships of a meaningful nature, not bullshit stuff, okay, but partnerships of a meaningful nature, you're not doing your job as a board. We force every board that we're engaged in to deal with this subject area. And we're watching, I've been involved with organizations that are trying to figure out who they can leverage with. I just did a board facilitation yesterday morning on this exact subject with a national nonprofit organization, because it's going to happen. And so don't let it happen to you. Get out front of that. I mean, today, I'll give you an example. In the corporate world, one of the things you always do is you basically, at least you did, I think today it's moving too fast, maybe not, you always knew you had a white knight. You know what the white knight was? When stuff got really bad and you had to know you had to sell, that person was primed, they knew you had laid the groundwork. And I'll give you an example. When we were sold and acquired in 1995, we had labored long and hard for 10 years to cultivate a relationship with IBM to be the white knight for our corporation. Well, this offer came in, it was big enough that we couldn't refuse the offer. We tried to call IBM, no one would answer. We didn't know what the hell was going on, okay? Well, our deal goes down. It's the largest transaction. It's a $2 billion transaction, the largest one in how many years in the sector. 11 days later, IBM announces the acquisition of a company called Lotus for $3.5 billion. And the reason they weren't calling us is they were doing a consolidation and we lost out. Now, where's your white knight? Where's your partners? Where are you cultivating those relationships so that you can either act proactively or when everything hits the fan, you're ready to move when it hits? Every board, it's responsibility of every board to look at those two issues. How do you consolidate and how do you partner today?
So the only thing I'll add just a little bit is my own experience with our own network where we haven't seen consolidation and we could. And one of the things that we haven't figured out but is a huge factor is, I go back to the boards. Boards of directors in a community, a network like ours of community-based organizations are deeply emotionally invested in the work. And there is an irrationality around looking at the data and their deep sense of their identity being extended through this organization. So I think Mario makes a very important point. It's going to take a significant amount of pressure, and unfortunately, there aren't a lot of white knights. in our sector. And so what that is going to be is a very unfortunate disruption, I fear, that could, ultimately the losers are the clients that we're serving. Because instability in community-based organizations is, I think, is a crime, because it is the promise of trust that something will change that is broken. And that is the platform on which real movement forward, breaking the cycle of poverty in our case, where it is. So just want to put that out there. There's something about figuring that piece out without it blowing up.
So it's the beauty and the curse of mission, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it
exactly.
really is. I think we're going to need to take some questions, would like to take some questions from the audience, if we have anyone out there. I think there's one in the back. I can't see that well from here, sorry.
Let's see.
And introduce yourself, please.
Faye Tversky. I always have a question, so. I'm curious about your certainty, Mario, about the mergers and the disruptive change that you think we're going to see, and that Dan, you were echoing as well, because I don't actually see evidence of that. So what we do see is the ongoing creation of new nonprofits all the time. We don't see very many going out of business. And we've been talking about mergers in the sector for at least a decade, and it really hasn't happened. And so while it may be a good thing, but I don't actually see the evidence for it actually emerging. And so I'm wondering how you think it can come about, how we could maybe help it come about if you think it's the right thing.
Well, let me start off right away with, if you have any knowledge of the Catholic school system, absolutely under siege. Total evidence right now. Churches and schools are shutting down and actually combining. It's going on. I mean, I can take you to Cleveland, I can take you to Washington, the cities we worked in. I mean, it's there in spades in the Catholic Church today for a series of reasons. In our portfolio, we've already had 2 consolidations in our portfolio. Living proof, and actually good ones. I mean, they're they were somewhat financially forced, in all honesty, because of where things went, but when they ended up, it was because of the relationship and structure, they were constructive consolidations. Billy Shore's organization, Share Strength, has actually, the Community Wealth Ventures Group is doing work in this area today and actually has forged several, but a facilitator for a number of significant, and when I say number, 4 or 5 really meaningful consolidations in the sector today. So I think this is going on. Now, whether we're seeing it at the national level, at the foundation level, I don't know, but it's a reality in many communities today. So I mean, I would venture there. And I think the thing I do, I'm an ex-M&A guy, okay? I led the M&A for 6 years. What bothers me about it is sometimes being driven by business people, and I'm one of those, and they don't understand the sort of the sensitivities and the complexities of the social interventions we have going on, and they'll make huge mistakes by driving a point of view on that. And I think one of the things we got to caution is we have to look at those consolidations constructively, thoughtfully about the people involved, meaning those being served, the institutions being served, because they're not businesses. They are nonprofits, and there's a difference. Mm-hmm. But that's where the foundation world can play a very constructive role about making sure that kind of thoughtfulness, that kind of sensitivity, that kind of understanding of the social complexity is understood by the people who are driving some of these actions.
So a couple of years ago in Northeast Ohio, it was when the economy had gone down the last time, we all knew, in our foundation colleagues knew, that we would have less financial support to provide. And so we convened a group of nonprofit human services organizations to talk about the other kinds of help that we could provide. And the overarching area that they talked about was, we know we need to work better with others. We need to think about collaboration, merging, and so forth. We don't know how to do that. And so we came back to ourselves and we said, we don't know how to do that either. But we all pitched in some money. We actually had 18 funders that pooled $400,000, and we commissioned a pilot project that would be an 18-month process of learning with our grantees about collaboration and mergers. We engaged a consultant team. We actually did an RFP with the nonprofits, and we thought that 3 different consultants would do a good job. So we asked them to collaborate on a proposal that came back to us then, and we funded this 18-month process. It was about collaboration, it was about mergers, but it was bigger than that. It was really so that we could learn, along with the nonprofit community, what it takes to collaborate effectively. And through the process, although the transactions were not the primary process, product, learning was, 8 nonprofits merged into 4, significant nonprofits merged into 4. That was a great byproduct. But that was 2 years ago. And so now, and we did a case study on that. In fact, we presented it at the last GEO conference. But we've now, a couple of us have commissioned a follow-up study to say, okay, now, 2 years down the road, how are these mergers going? What can we learn now about how to support nonprofits in their efforts to collaborate? Because in our community, it is happening. It's a necessity. Just because of our population decline and the level of our economy, the need is so much higher. We just can't support as many nonprofits as we once were able to do. And so that's how we got to the fact that collaboration is one of the areas in capacity building that we fund over and above operating and program support.
Yeah, and I have to say, Faye, I think I'm living proof. There's certainly been consolidation in the nonprofit sector, but the last couple of years we were in business, the noise among other national agencies about not being able to compete, and there were lots of conversations about potentially merging and aligning, and I think that we're going to see a lot more of it. I think one of the best pieces I ever read was Paul Light in the Washington Post. He has a wonderful Light on Leadership column, or he used to, and he did a piece on the consolidation of the nonprofit sector. And the fear I have is it's not going to be thoughtful. And funders have never known how to engage in it well. I mean, I know from 20 years ago at Pew, we tried to do some of that work. But it's going to happen, and it is happening. And the fear is that, as he says, there are going to be entire service deserts because it's not going to be done in a way that addresses the needs of the clients that must be served. And the best are not necessarily going to be the ones that survive in terms of actual high-performing organizations. So I think it's happening, and I think it's a very big issue for funders, and I can't help but step in and interject.
I just want to make one comment that is based on our experience. So going forward, Faye, we're actually having a consolidated model, meaning that New Mexico is a great example. We were approached by a nonprofit that said, we'd like to join your network, and we're putting them through kind of a post-market conversion strategy. So that's an interesting growing body of our work that's a kind of merger. It's still nascent, but the point I want to make that I think often we don't talk about is public funding is like for the social service industry particularly, that's bread and butter. Those are jobs, and those are constituents. And so there is, I think, a very important set of reasons why we don't see consolidation. And I think that there is a black box around the political patronage system at the local community level that is very, very important to understand before we can start pushing. I think Mario's point about shrinking budgets is going to put a kind of pressure on the system that I think is an opportunity. But it is a nasty conversation. I was just I won't say which school system. We were talking about the use of Title I's for effective practice. And literally a school board member said to me, you don't understand, there are paraprofessionals that depend on this work to do academic services. Never mind whether they're effective in driving outcomes. It is about jobs for her constituents. So I think there are a number of very tricky issues embedded in this.
I think we should take one more question. I'm sorry, there's one right here in the front.
Melinda Twan. I co-founded REDF, the Roberts Enterprise Development Fund, back in 1997. And I've since been consulting in philanthropy for the last 10 years. And I just continue to be struck by this dialogue about the importance of general operating support, multi-year support, taking risks, investing in leadership, trusting nonprofits, funding based on results, and yet it's still not common practice in the foundation world, much less sort of individuals or the public sector. And I just keep struggling with why is that the case? And what is it going to take for us as a foundation field to adopt these effective practices? So I would welcome any comment from any of you on that. Thank you.
I have one very brief comment. I think continuity of leadership is probably one of the underlying factors. So I'll use the school systems again as an example. Every new superintendent comes in with his or her new vision, and what was effective and working is actually antithetical to the career move this person wants to make. How different is philanthropy, right? Program officers churn, foundation presidents churn, boards churn. So the notion of continuity of strategy and hanging in there, our longest funders, it's not by mistake that we had long-term relationships with the most stable set of leadership where we got those kinds of resources. And when we saw a change in leadership, we saw funding change. So I think there's something about, career and making a difference and institutions and longevity that is a tough nut to crack. That's been my experience.
Dan, totally agree with Dan. But another thing I would say is, in this our limited experience, is because of the skill sets of foundations, and maybe where their skills are in one area, and therefore the lack of appreciation of issues like management and leadership and human capital development, more needs to be done by the sector in general to illustrate to a foundation why there's value here. And I think that's a huge step today. And it's why, communities and schools got to be shown, and why youth villages has got to be shown. You can show that if you do these things, you as a foundation will actually be better off 5, 10 years from now in your performance. We have done a horrible job of making that linkage for foundations today.
Okay, I show 0. I'm sure we're happy to continue, but I think it's probably time. Okay. Well, thank you all. This is a wonderful conversation. Thank you.